Chapter 7, First Pilgrimage to South America. In our early days together, Rick and I had no comprehension of how far Grandfather had traveled in his life. We were often amazed by how far Grandfather had traveled. When we asked Grandfather where he had learned a particular skill or technique, more often than not, Grandfather would tell us that the origin of the skill came not only from Mexico, Canada, Alaska, but even Central America. His knowledge and collection of skills came from the people of the United States, but seemed to reach outside the borders. Frequently, Grandfather would include with his description of a certain skill its origins and how and where he had first learned its making and use. Many times, that was our only indication of how extensively Grandfather had traveled and gave us an idea as to how many people he had sought out for these skills. We found out about his trip into the Amazon jungles quite by accident. We had assumed, since the subject had never come up, that Grandfather never visited South America. We just figured that he had remained mostly in North America, venturing down only as far as Panama. After all, most of the skills we had learned up until this point in our lives were from the United States, and only a few had come from south of the border. On this particular occasion, we had been practicing our skill with the bow and arrow, focusing our attention mainly on aerial shots. We were trying to master the technique of hunting birds in flight or perched in high trees, but our accuracy had not been very good. We never seemed to be able to loft the arrow high enough or with enough force to hit the targets we had placed in the trees. There seemed to be something missing in our technique. Our little bows just did not seem stable enough. Grandfather had been watching our limited ability from afar. As soon as we saw him watching, we got worse. Because I felt like I was being closely scrutinized by Grandfather, my hands began to tremble even more than they did earlier in practice, and I began to horribly miss the shots. I just could not get any stability. As Rick took his turn and shot a few arrows, I watched Grandfather disappear inside his shelter and emerge carrying what I assumed to be a long stick. As he drew closer, I realized that what he was carrying was in fact a rather long bow, longer than I had ever seen. The bow was brightly colored, and 2 large green feathers and a small red one hung from one end. So, too, were the arrows brightly colored and very long. They were of a Fletch design I had never seen before. Grandfather approached us with a smile on his face. Rick and I stood gaping at the long bow as Grandfather began to string it and test its pull. The bow was majestic, the pull strong, but it lacked any abrupt curve such as was found in an eared or recurved bow that we had made so often. Instead, the bow was just one long, elegant curve. Without a word, Grandfather knocked an arrow, pulled the bow straight and steady, then released the arrow right through the same target we had been trying to hit all day. He did this twice more until he offered the bow to us. Without awaiting any explanation, I knocked the arrow, aimed to the high target, and released the arrow. The bow was absolutely stable and true, and I hit the target. Without a word, Rick did the same, also hitting the target. We were both amazed at how well the bow performed. We asked Grandfather about the longbow, telling him that we were amazed at how well it shot and how very stable it was. Grandfather told us that the people who had shown him the bow did most of their hunting up in the trees. The bow was designed for high shots where the targets were relatively small and they needed stability and strength of the bow draw to reach their target with any accuracy. He then told us that most of their targets were parrots and monkeys found high up in the upper branches of the South American jungles. We were flabbergasted by what Grandfather was telling us. The jungle was always an intriguing dream to us, and we wanted to have Grandfather tell us all about what it was like to go there. We had never thought to ask him if he had ever been there, and now we felt foolish that we hadn't asked. That night at the campfire, Grandfather told us of his first trip into South America. Grandfather said that it was more by an unconscious accident than by choice that he ended up in South America. At the time, he had been traveling slowly through southern Mexico when the urge hit him to travel further south. Up until this point in his life, he had never been further south than the Panama jungles, but he just knew that the Spirit was leading him further south than he had ever been before. Stories of the immense South American jungle wilderness had only been conveyed to him in stories that his great-grandfather, Coyote Thunder, had told him. And even these stories had been passed down to his great-grandfather. As far as Grandfather knew, no one of his tribe had ever ventured much past the southern borders of Mexico. He was the first to go beyond. A few years before, Grandfather had been living in the Everglades for several months and had some knowledge of the tropical conditions, but nothing would compare or prepare him for what he had yet to encounter. Traveling the many jungles he had to pass through along the way proved difficult enough. He was not at all familiar with the plants and animals of these jungles and had to rely on his inner vision to guide him to what was edible and what was not. Fortunately, his hunting and fishing skills proved more than adequate to obtain game, so it was rare that he was ever without meat. His plant diet, however, was severely lacking, and encountering the plants he was familiar with became rarer the further south he traveled. By the time he reached the great South American jungles, he was rather thin and worn out from lack of a balanced diet. His drive to reach the jungle had overshadowed his common sense. He realized that he should not have been in such a rush to get there and should have taken better care of his physical needs. Now that he had reached the infinite jungle, he was in rather poor condition and totally out of his element. Though he could still easily hunt and trap game, there were very few plants that he was familiar with. These were also few and far between. There was no doubt in his mind that he would have to find a better diet and get back to a healthier state of existence before he could ever think of striking out into the deeper jungles. Grandfather's exhaustion ran very deep. He had hardly stopped for many thousands of miles. Not once did he camp for more than a day in any area since he left the southern border of Mexico. Many times he traveled days without food, and rarely did he get a full night's sleep. The nagging spirit within seemed to drag him onward without let-up. At times it would hardly let him sleep at all. Even his dreams were of journeys into the jungle, and they too had a sense of rushing. He had been definitely driven to this place, driven to the brink of utter exhaustion and malnutrition. He knew that he could not go on until he got a long period of rest and rebuild his strength. He resolved himself, despite the spiritual nagging, that he would stay where he was for several days before going on. Within the span of a full day, Grandfather had built his shelter, laid out traps, built a fire, and set about making camp comfortable. He found water easily and put up several days of meat he had hunted. Still, he lacked the vegetarian part of his diet. He had exhausted the last few familiar plants that he knew to be edible, but refused to take them all for fear of wiping out the species in the area. Eventually, he lost his appetite and soon began to grow very lethargic and sickly. He could not communicate with his inner vision, eventually growing not to trust his judgment. It was only through his inner vision that he could discern the edible plants from the poisonous, and now it seemed to be failing him. The last 2 plants that Grandfather was guided to through his inner vision had made him sick. He assumed that in his weakened state his inner vision was rendered ineffective. This sickness and the weakened state grew worse as the days passed. Certainly he was getting enough sleep and enough water, but his diet was sorely lacking. He began to wonder if he had contracted some rare jungle disease, and that was the reason for his sickness. Yet he had gone for many months of his life on a strictly meat diet, especially when he was living with the Eskimo people, and he could not understand now why the lack of plants in his diet could cause such a severe reaction. He began to think seriously about making a retreat to the coast where he knew that he could find plants that he was familiar with. He thought of traveling down the Amazon River and to the Delta region that he had so often heard stories about. There he knew would be native people living on the fringe of the jungle. Possibly they could help him with his sickness. It was well into the 2nd week in the deep jungles that Grandfather decided to pack up his camp and make the journey to the coast. He knew that in his weakened state it would be a very difficult journey at best, and he began to doubt if he could make it alive. As he was beginning to take the roof from his shelter and scatter it back to the earth, he noticed an old man standing at the far end of his camp, watching him intently. Grandfather was shocked that he hadn't been aware of the old man's arrival. Certainly he should have known of his approach miles before he even got to camp. But there was something about the way that this old man blended perfectly into the jungle that told Grandfather he was not dealing with an ordinary person. As Grandfather gazed at the old man smiled warmly and waved. As Grandfather waved back, the old man vanished into the jungle without a trace, right before Grandfather's eyes. Grandfather was startled at how easily the old one had slipped away. As he searched the immediate area with his eyes, he began to believe that this old man was in fact a spirit, not of flesh at all. That is the only way that he could have made it right into Grandfather's camp without being detected. Grandfather simply shrugged off the experience and went back to work, trying to understand why this spirit had come to him. As he thought about the incident, he realized how the old one had been dressed. Though his lower body was clothed in a small loincloth, his headdress was made of beautiful bright green feathers, the likes of which he had never seen before. Everything else about the old one told of his native heritage. Possibly this man's spirit was one time a member of a tribe that once lived in the area. As Grandfather continued working, deep in thought, he felt a hand touch his shoulder, and he turned around with a start. The old man stood before him, as if appearing from nowhere. Grandfather was startled again that he did not hear his approach. The old one seemed to be invisible in the cadence and flow of the forest, blending perfectly with his surroundings. Still assuming that the old one was spirit, Grandfather slowly reached out and touched the old man's shoulder. The old man did the same to Grandfather, and they both laughed. With that, the old one waved to the bushes, and several young men stood up. Grandfather was absolutely flabbergasted that so many people had gotten right into his camp without being noticed. He knew that his energy was low and his awareness shrouded in sickness, but to him this was impossible. He must have looked so startled that the group began to laugh, not at Grandfather, but with him. The old one seemed to sense that Grandfather was in pain and sickened. He gently reached out and felt Grandfather's head, then retracted his hand and said something in a language that Grandfather could not understand. Grandfather trembled uncontrollably, but did not know why. The next thing that Grandfather remembered was that the jungle began to spin and he collapsed to the ground. He could feel kind and gentle hands lifting him, but he could not piece together the events that followed. All he remembered was movement, passing jungle, and the feeling of being carried. His whole world seemed to spin uncontrollably. Thought became impossible, and he seemed to be living in some surrealistic dream world. Then all was black. Time and place seemed no longer to exist. Grandfather remembered waking up in a strange shelter, feeling very groggy. He tried to piece together the events that got him there, but everything remained a blur of events. All he could clearly remember was the old man who had come to his camp. He was frightened at first, but this passed as he looked around the shelter more closely and saw it was primitive. This gave him a certain sense of security that he was in good hands with these ancient people. He sensed that they were much like him, though he did not know why. He did know that he was beginning to feel better, much better, than he had in many days, though he had no idea as to how he got there or how long he'd been asleep. There was evidence all around him that people had come and gone through the entire ordeal. He felt at peace. He heard a shuffling at the doorway, and in walked the old man who he had seen in his camp. A big smile spread across the old man's face as he looked at Grandfather. They both tried to communicate in words, but to no avail. Realizing that words now were useless, the old man pointed to Grandfather's lower leg and lifted a leaf bandage from the calf. To Grandfather's amazement, there was a badly swollen area, definitely caused by some sort of bite, probably an insect of some sort. The old one made a gesture to his head, feigning, fainting, and fever, and Grandfather finally understood. Grandfather had vaguely remembered getting bitten by something several days earlier, but had paid no attention. It was around the same time of the bite that Grandfather remembered growing very weak and losing his appetite. At the time, he did not connect the two, but now he understood. Grandfather finally realized that he had been poisoned by some insect, and if it had not been for the old man, he probably would be dead by now. That was probably the reason that Grandfather had lost his awareness and inner vision and did not see the approach of the old man and the others. Throughout the day, Grandfather and the old man began to communicate as other people came in and out of the shelter, bringing food and otherwise taking care of Grandfather. As time passed, Grandfather began to understand the old man a little better, though much of the communication was in a loose sign language. It did not take long before Grandfather knew that this old one was probably the herbalist or shaman of this little tribe. Such was his ability and the other people's respect for him. Grandfather was allowed to rest through the end of the day without much of a conversation. The old one sat by Grandfather throughout the evening and well into the night, rarely leaving his side, even for a moment. Several times during the night, Grandfather was awakened by the old one and given a strong tea to drink. Otherwise, his sleep was peaceful and almost dreamless. When he awakened the next morning, he felt the best he had since he left Mexico. The old man looked very pleased with Grandfather's progress, but would not allow him to sit up until he had something to eat. After drinking a strong tea and eating some delicious but unknown herbs and roots, Grandfather was helped into a sitting position. He could feel a nagging weakness deep inside, but he knew that it was on its way out. Late in the morning, the old man helped Grandfather to his feet. At first he was a bit shaky, but soon his strength returned. The bite on his leg was no longer swollen or painful, but he could still see the deep punctures. The old one had intimated to Grandfather that he should have been dead from the bite long ago. The old one seemed amazed at how quickly Grandfather had healed. Grandfather and the old man began to sense something special about each other, something that bound them deeper than just the flesh. There was a mutual respect between them, and they spent most of the morning and the remainder of the afternoon trying to communicate. The conversation was slow and labored, but they began to understand each other on deeper levels than just words and sign language. Grandfather was led around the small camp by the old man and introduced to various people. The old one pointed out the various shelters, the skills, and the way the people prepared the food. Most of the skills Grandfather had used before, but what fascinated him the most were the plants that the people used, both for food and for medication. For some reason, Grandfather was interested in these with a passion. The old man, who Grandfather knew as Parrot, saw Grandfather's interest in the plants and began to concentrate his teaching efforts to that of the plants. Grandfather became a willing student, hanging on Parrot's every gesture. However, as the day wore on, Grandfather grew very tired again. Even the short journey around camp was a strain on him, and he returned to the shelter to rest. It was at this time, when he lay down to sleep, that he was in the old man's bed, for the old one slept on the floor every night next to Grandfather. For the next several days, Grandfather and Parrot stayed together. Parrot became more than a willing teacher and Grandfather an eager student. Parrot first showed Grandfather the various plants around the immediate camp area. They would collect the plants, prepare them, cook them, and finally eat them. This way, the spirit of the plant could be fully understood and remembered. So, too, did Grandfather learn how to make up and use the various medicinal plants of the jungle. He was intrigued by how similar the effects were as compared to the plants that he had always worked with. With each passing day, they went further and further into the jungle where more exotic plants could be found. The old man was treating Grandfather much like he would have treated an herbal apprentice, though Grandfather learned much faster. Eventually, Parrot began to see Grandfather's deeper spiritual side and realized that Grandfather must be a healer for his own tribe. It was at this point that Parrot began to treat Grandfather as his equal, rather than just a student. It was not long before Grandfather began to teach Parrot of his ways. Grandfather also began to teach the various other tribal members about traps, tracking, and his method of survival. Grandfather was eventually treated with as much respect from the people as was Parrot. The two became very close friends, and Parrot even allowed Grandfather to help treat many of his patients. Sometimes Parrot would allow Grandfather to treat his patient alone. To them, it was delightful to be able to mix medicines and skills. Grandfather felt at home with his adopted people. As the months slipped by, Grandfather and Parrot began to understand and communicate with each other a lot faster. It was not long before they both realized that even though their cultures were many thousand miles apart, there were more things similar than different. In the practice of medicine and the wisdom of the spirit, they were almost identical in philosophy and technique. Grandfather began to understand that a common thread bound his people to these people of the Amazon jungles. Eventually, neither Grandfather nor Parrot saw any difference. This realization helped Grandfather confirm that all people of the earth shared a common truth, a common thread that bound them all together in one spiritual consciousness. Yet, he still had his doubts concerning the white man and his various religions, however. Grandfather stayed with these people for the better part of a year. Eventually, he built his own shelter, participated in hunting and gathering parties, took an important part in the various ceremonies, and otherwise became a full working member of the little tribe. Most of all, he and Parrot attended to the many ills, both physical and spiritual, of the people. They formed a deep bond between them, a deeper friendship than either of them had yet known. They considered each other brothers in the truest sense of the word. Once they took a journey together to one of the most sacred areas that Parrott had known. There they worshipped for several days, entering into what Grandfather would consider a vision quest. It was during this time that the bittersweet realization that Grandfather would be leaving soon was understood. Grandfather stayed with the little tribe for a few more weeks, and then finally, one day he was gone before the camp awoke. Parrott understood, like Grandfather, that this was the right way to part. Nothing left to be said, no goodbyes, but just a deep sense of knowing that they would always be together. Still, there was a tremendous sadness and sense of loss that they would both suffer. Though no one knew exactly the day that Grandfather would be leaving, Grandfather found a beautiful longbow by his side when he awakened that morning. It belonged to Parrott and was the bow he used to learn the tribe's way of hunting. On the end of the limb were 2 long green parrot feathers and 1 red feather. It was the symbol of everlasting bond between Grandfather and Parrott, between Grandfather's people and the people of the jungle. Grandfather wandered up the Amazon and deep into the jungle as he had planned to do more than a year ago. Now armed with his new knowledge of the local plants and the way of the jungle, his travels became easy. It was as effortless as living in his homeland, and for the first time he really felt part of the jungle. As the days passed by and he reached deeper into the jungle, he understood why the people of the earth were closely bound together in spiritual consciousness. It was the earth that bound them and created that common thread. Here he felt at home, for all the earth now was his home. It was the earth that was the common philosophy and purity, the same bonds that tied Grandfather to Parrott and to his people, bound them to the earth. It was a common ground to all who walk the sacred path. The spirit constantly compelled Grandfather to go deeper into the jungle. Grandfather instinctively knew that there was much more that he had to learn from the jungle, a knowledge that would tend to tie everything he had learned together. He never camped for more than a night in any one location. Instead, he kept moving, feeding as did the animals, foraging along the way, and rarely stopping to cook anything. For most of the journey, he ate nothing but the plants. Only once did he supplement his vegetarian diet with fish. The jungle seemed to dictate to him that he needed only the plants on this type of journey, and his health and energy remained high. He was learning to listen to the jungle as it taught him the plants and sensitized his inner vision to that of the jungle consciousness. Finally, Grandfather felt that he could not go any deeper into the jungle. It was not because he was physically unable to, but spiritually he felt that this was where he was supposed to be. It did not take Grandfather long before he found a beautiful camp area not far from a little waterfall. He could feel that the waterfall was important, for it had an undeniable spiritual presence that beckoned him to it. It was a special place, a sacred place of power, and he wondered if Parrott knew of this place. Within the span of 2 days, Grandfather's camp was built and his food stores filled. He then concentrated on spiritual things, visiting the waterfall religiously to pray and listen to the voice of the jungle. Without fail, every sunrise and every sunset was met at the waterfall. Sometimes Grandfather would spend the entire day in and around the fall. One afternoon, Grandfather looked up from the water and was startled to see a very old man standing on the brink, looking at him. He had appeared much the same way as Parrott had, and at first Grandfather thought that it might be Parrott. But this man was far too old to be Parrott, yet the mannerisms were much the same. The old man waved to Grandfather, and Grandfather returned the gesture with a broad smile. Grandfather realized that the waterfall had blotted out all outside sound, but he should have noted the approach of the old man long before he appeared on the brink. Grandfather instantly knew that this old man must be a shaman, for his appearance and attitude were of that consciousness. So too did Parrot move about the jungle in this way, and Grandfather felt an instant bond between himself and this old man. There was something very familiar about him. The old man motioned to Grandfather to follow him, and Grandfather went without hesitation. The old one moved quickly through the jungle, disturbing nothing as he passed. The old man disappeared far up ahead, and it wasn't long before Grandfather entered a small clearing. At one end of the clearing was a small and simple hut, much the same as Parrot's shelter, only smaller and more primitive. Grandfather saw that the old one had gone inside, and he followed. As Grandfather entered the shelter, he was startled to see not only the old man, but also sitting near him was Parrot. The resemblance between the two was striking. Grandfather understood immediately that Parrot and this old man were somehow related. Possibly, Grandfather thought, the old man was, in fact, Parrot's teacher and guide. Parrot introduced Grandfather to the old man, and Grandfather's suspicions were confirmed. This old man was not only Parrot's teacher, but also his blood grandfather. Parrot told Grandfather that the old man's name translated to "he who has no name." The reason for this, Parrot told Grandfather, was because No Name had transcended the tribe, the religion, and even his own identity. He was truly a child of the earth and lived without the need of many of the spiritual toys and crutches that still bind men to the flesh. No Name had been the teacher of many shaman, but now preferred to live alone, close to the jungle consciousness. Parrot told Grandfather that the shaman came to this place, to this small but sacred waterfall, for spiritual renewal and to learn the wisdom of No Name. Grandfather was more than delighted to see Parrot again. They hugged each other for a long time and cried. Grandfather always knew that he would see Parrot again, but not so soon. Yet somehow he suspected that he would see him here near the waterfall. Grandfather was even more captivated with No Name. This old one reminded Grandfather of his own great-grandfather. No Name seemed to have the same unspoken wisdom that Grandfather had seen in Coyote Thunder. Within a few hours, a great bond was formed between the three men. Grandfather and Parrot became No Name's students for many weeks to come, and Grandfather began to look upon No Name the same way he looked upon his own great-grandfather. This old one possessed the jungle wisdom that he desperately wanted to know. He knew that the spirit had led him to this place to meet and learn from No Name, and now there was no doubt in his mind. The three did not concentrate on the physical identification of plants, or for that matter on anything else tangible to the flesh. Instead, they discussed philosophy and learned No Name's approach to the many things of the spirit. Grandfather here again saw a similarity and correlation to what he understood and believed. It was confirmed that there could be no separation between the people of the earth. They were of one mind and heart. The fabric of spiritual consciousness ran through them all. So too did Grandfather realize that when one truly walks the shamanic path, he transcends all religions, doctrines, ceremonies, and even the people. Here, on this path of all shaman, no matter where they are from, or how they learn the wisdom of the spirit, walk as one and have one mind. How they arrived on this path no longer makes a difference, and they speak a common tongue and have a common knowledge. Grandfather held No Name in awe. This old man had truly found the final path to spiritual enlightenment. In that path, Grandfather found a certain and pure simplicity, unencumbered by any of man's complications. It was this simplicity that Grandfather had sought for so long. It was this simplicity that Grandfather wanted to live. The old one was living proof that the quest of the Spirit was not difficult, but free and pure. It was man and his quest to define and complicate the wisdom of the Spirit that made the path difficult. Grandfather knew that he too had transcended most religious crutches, and now No Name showed him the way to abandon the rest. On one particular morning, the camp was deftly abandoned. Grandfather wandered back to the north. Parrot returned to his people, and No Name vanished into the vast expanse of the jungle. Parting was painful. Loneliness had already begun to set in. But there was a sweet joy of the sharing and communication that bonded these three men together forever. As I sat at the campfire listening to Grandfather's story and holding the old bow, I could feel how sacred the bow was. To Grandfather, it was not just the skill of hunting, but the embodiment of all that he had learned on his trip deep into the jungles. I was amazed to tears to hear Grandfather talk of a common path and how all shamans spoke a common tongue. Most of all, I was intrigued by the simplicity and interconnectedness of it all. From that point on, the old bow became a symbol of simplicity to me also. I finally understood what Grandfather had meant when he spoke of oneness. It was not just the oneness of flesh and spirit, but also the oneness with all things, all philosophies.